Welcome. My name is Sabrina Shankman. I report on climate change at the Boston Globe, and I'll be moderating today's discussion of air pollution and the brain. I am delighted to be joined by today's panelists. Pleased to introduce Maite Arce, President and CEO of Hispanic Access Foundation, Joe Allen, an Associate Professor of Exposure Assessment Science and Environmental Health, and the Director of the Healthy Buildings Program here at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, Francesca Dominici, the Clarence James Gamble Professor of Biostatistics, Population and Data Science at the Harvard Chan School, and Mark Weisskopf, the Cecil K. and Philip Drinker Professor of Environmental Epidemiology and Physiology, also at Harvard Chan School. Thank you all for being here. A reminder that today all the speakers here are going to be sharing their own views. They do not speak for the school. And thank you all for being here today in the audience. So let's jump in. An increasing amount of evidence has linked air pollution exposure to poor brain health, including cognitive decline and mood disorders. Mark and Francesca, maybe you could start us off. What do we know about the connection between the air we breathe and our brains?
Start? Okay, I'll start.
Go ahead.
Well, there is more and more emerging evidence that especially long-term exposure to air pollution increase incidence and progression of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson and other neurocognitive disease. The work I've been conducting together with many colleagues here at the School of Public Health are been basically analyzing the entire national healthcare system, the Medicare and Medicaid claims. We've been following several individuals over time, actually not several, million of individuals over time, assessing their long-term exposure to fine particulate matter. And so very briefly, and then I can say more about it, but what we are finding from this study with enormous statistical power is that long-term exposure to fine particulate matter increases the incidence and hospitalization of Alzheimer's disease. It also increases the progression in terms of rehospitalization of Alzheimer's disease. And also we are seeing that among people that are diagnosed with Alzheimer's, exposure to fine particulate matter tends to increase the rate of hospitalization for all causes and also increase risk of mortality.
Okay. Mark.
Yeah, and I guess if I can add from a sort of biological perspective, I mean, I think sort of the exploration of air pollution in the brain is relatively new. It's newer than many other outcomes. And I think one of the early things that got people interested in thinking this might be going on was the wealth of data that exists already on things like cardiovascular effects of air pollution, which there's a lot of data behind on many levels. And the brain is frankly hugely dependent on the cardiovascular system. So if the cardiovascular system's affected, we think there could be impacts on the brain. And I think that started that sort of was at the origins of the interest that maybe something's going on there. And we do know that that can absolutely happen. And that is one of the ways the brain can be impacted through air pollution. There's a lot of interest now, and it's an active area of exactly what biology is happening with these particles. But there's, particles can generate sort of inflammatory immune effects in the systemic circulation that can get to the brain. There's some ideas that the particles can get to the brain directly, actually, not just through these secondary effects. And more recently, there's been a lot of interest on the idea that actually, so when you breathe in through your nose, you're smelling things because you've got neurons that are kind of sticking out in the world, exploring it that way. And we now understand that some particles or aspects of particles can actually get transported directly back into the brain, so skipping the lungs and the cardiovascular system. So that's an almost more immediate route. And people have seen, in like dogs from Mexico City versus a cleaner part of Mexico, you can sort of see effects that we believe to be the particle type effects going on in the brain, and sort of evidence there that something is happening. But it's a very active area of research as to this very specific biology of what may be going on. But there are many things that could be happening.
That's fascinating. We're going to ask a little bit more about that in a little bit, because that is a really interesting area. But it's not just these kinds of effects that we've seen. I understand there's also a link to anxiety and depression from poor air quality, and that's shown up in school performance too. Joe, could you talk a little bit about the acute effects on cognitive tests that you've seen?
Yeah, for sure. So we actually had a program right here at the School of Public Health on the surprising link between air pollution and mental health. And our team summarized the findings that you see largely in kids, and we see air pollution linked with things like anxiety, suicide ideation, big studies and we see increases in pediatric hospitalizations related to psychiatric disorders linked to air pollution. My own work has been around indoor air quality, so another type of air pollution and cognitive function impacts. So we've done studies of, say, office workers where we've changed the air they were breathing. We introduced air pollution into their space. In this case, it was air pollution like off-gassing from dry cleaning and dry erase markers without them knowing in a double-blind study, and then we test their cognitive function performance. And we see they perform worse on these tests. And these tests are things like, how do I seek out and utilize information in the world? How do I make strategic decisions? How to respond during a crisis? And that was in a double-blind controlled study. But then we did that same kind of study globally, and we had about 450 office workers, and the same thing. And we looked at indoor air quality and these cognitive outcomes, and this will tie into the work here. We actually saw a link between PM 2.5, so a main component of outdoor air pollution, and acute performance on these cognitive function tests. So air pollution measured at your desk, most of which is coming from outside, and these acute tests. So across all these dimensions, whether it's office workers, university workers, kids in elementary school, high school students, we see over and over the impacts of air pollution on the whole range, mental health, anxiety, all the way through higher order cognitive function.
Wow. And Mayta, you've seen something related to schools, and right?
Yes, we have talked to parents in high Latino populated communities, and high exposure to particle matter 2.5 increases, it may increase the respiratory infections of children, which can lead to symptoms like asthma, and that can lead to school absences, and it can lead to less participation in school activity, and so it's definitely a concern that parents have.
What about when it comes to mental health, Mark? You've looked at that a bit.
Yeah, so we did one of the first studies in the Nurses' Health Study looking at PM and its relation to anxiety symptoms there. So absolutely, I mean, there's more of the focus is on kind of cognitive processing and for the knowledge, economy, et cetera. But all the kind of processing in the brain that is underlying how you learn and remember and how you function on a cognitive level is basically the same for mental health scenarios, and possibly there it's even can be considered more sensitive in a sense. So, if you sort of disrupt the what's going on in the brain, you can put yourself into, bad brain states, and that can either exacerbate underlying problems. And this is a big issue of what is actually occurring. Is it an exacerbation of something that's underlying in there, or is it actually, or both, is it actually contributing to a new development of something like that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Mark is saying, from analyzing massive amount of data, what we are also seeing that exposure to greenness, and so being able to spend more time in green parks actually has a protective effect on hospitalization and progression of Alzheimer's disease. We haven't looked specifically to mental health. These are mostly studied in the elderly, but it complements and it's consistent with what Mark is saying. Now, we need to understand even better whether the access to the green space also means that there is less particulate matter because you are in the park, but we're actually seeing an evidence that even with the same exposure to particulate matter, if you are close to a park or you're spending more time in a park, the adverse effect of particulate matter on Alzheimer's is lower than if you don't have access to green space.
Do you know what it is about that access to the park that is causing that?
Well, we are not studying the mechanism, and we can't, so not really. But I think that could provide some hypothesis of what additional, biological mechanism we want to study that will inform that protective effect. But we do have tremendous amount of evidence of a positive effect of spending time in nature has a protective effect on mental health. So I think, I will guess it will be a similar mechanism.
Interesting. Communities of color are often disproportionately exposed to pollution. Here's an example. More than 56 million Latinos live in the 15 worst urban areas with the most ground level ozone pollution. So there's a clip from a video that we're going to watch from the Hispanic Access Foundation. It's an interview with a woman who's been impacted by air pollution in Phoenix, Arizona.
Hi, my name is Yara Marin, and I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. So I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, specifically South Central Phoenix, which is the epicenter of pollution and factories. And as a result, I actually grew up having asthma, and a lot of my cousins and my friends growing up did too. And so it was very frustrating as I got older to learn that that was a direct result of the environment that I grew up in, the parks that I went to, and because I was exposed to a lot of those dirty fossil fuels and that pollution from living under highways. And so as I've gotten older, it has really become important for me to do Latino advocacy, especially around public parks and outdoors, and ensuring that our Latino children and our community members have access to clean parks where they can step outside, enjoy our beautiful Madre Tierra, and not have to worry about having respiratory issues or being exposed to dirty fossil fuels and harmful fumes that can cause asthma.
Maite, can you talk a little bit about how the Hispanic Access Foundation has been working with Latino communities on air pollution?
Yes, we have just started a long-range program called El Aire que Respiramos, the air that we breathe. And we've recruited citizen scientists from 12 communities who are members of our faith-based networks who have the trust of their communities. And they are, they've formed a cohort, a learning cohort, where they're connecting with their peers to talk about air pollution and also learning from experts in air quality. These leaders, these citizen scientists, are using air quality sensors in their churches to monitor and report air quality in their communities, and then they're entering the data into an online mapping, an online map. They're also helping to work with us to develop materials that are tailored to the needs of their communities, who are primarily Spanish-speaking or immigrant communities, and they're disseminating that information in a variety of ways, from sermons at church services to film screenings and roundtables to community workshops, radio and social media. And then they're also supporting community in making practical changes to help improve their preparation when there's bad air quality days, like masking or staying indoors. And then very importantly, which is something Yara mentioned in the film, is they are advocates. And so they're inviting elected officials, decision makers into their churches to hear their concerns. And then they're also organizing in the community to really urge for policy change.
So across the sites where you're monitoring, what have you learned so far?
The biggest learning is how little to no knowledge there is about particulate matter 2.5. Just we're starting at zero in terms of the knowledge. People understand and are concerned and have been for a long time about the health and effects that they're seeing and what they're seeing in their community. But the understanding is just really eye-opening for them and makes them feel that urgency to take action.
Yeah. I mean, is there a lot known about those kind of racial and economic disparities when it comes to this? Like, where's the research on that? I don't know if I'm just kind of, if anyone.
Well, I mean, we published a study in Nature 3 years ago where we looked at exposure to fine particulate matter in the last 20 years by census tract in the United States, and look at chronic exposure by the percentage of underrepresented and minority in that census tract. And not surprising, what we saw is that although exposure to fine particulate matter, thanks to the Clean Air Act, has been decreasing over time, quite a lot actually, and that is definitely an excellent news. But we did see that the disparities, and so underrepresented minority, Hispanic, Latino, Black American, consistently breathe higher level of air pollution than white American. The other interesting thing is that happened especially for Black American, even when you stratified by socioeconomic status. So in the context of Black American, we didn't look at that specific question for Hispanic population, and we should and we will. But for Black American, what we found, which was very surprising to me, that high socioeconomic status Black American breed higher pollution level than low socioeconomic status white American. So that tells you a lot about the systemic bias and racism. Why? Well, what happened is in this marginalized community, there is less pressure and less attention to be in compliance with the different EPA rules. And we see that systematically. By the way, there is I don't want to speak too much about it, but there is a different study that we're conducting right now on exposure to air pollution from cryptocurrency data mining, which are not regulated in the United States. And not surprisingly, where this data mining and cryptocurrency are building, where are located, they tend always to be located in the lower socioeconomic status or in represented minority, because there is not the local government and the pressure of the citizen and the knowledge to fight back.
Does like historic redlining factor into this?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And if I could add related to that, because all of this is absolutely true, but one of the reasons why understanding the mechanisms of this stuff is important is that my suspicion is that at least one part of this is going to be a slightly more generic effect on the brain. So it will produce inflammation, immune response, things like that are generally perturb the brain and have all sorts of effects. But so do many other things, right?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily that air pollution is specifically the thing that causes Alzheimer's disease, right? But I think it's giving us a picture into potential mechanisms that get targeted by lots of other stuff. So on top of minoritized populations often having higher exposures to, say, air pollution, they also, as illustrated by that little clip you
Yes.
showed, have exposures to lots of other things. And so that can do all sorts of things. I mean, we just did a talk about the idea that maybe, and this is one of the things we think, there's something called the blood-brain barrier that is supposed to keep stuff out of the brain, but you can inflame that and you can make that leaky. And the more you're exposed to all these things, the worse that gets. So it's a double whammy of largely being exposed more to the very things, but also to many things, because these are the areas that aren't as regulated, or people sort of let industry go, and then you have all sorts of exposures like that person
Yeah.
on the clip.
I think one other thing, just to add to this and bring it back to Maitais, the work you're all doing, is that there's really been a fundamental shift in the technology, and it has led to empowerment and citizen science. So it used to be you'd have an EPA air quality monitor, a handful of them really around the country. We have some sophisticated models, but we've now put the power in the hands of the community to monitor for themselves and see what's happening. And that's because relatively new advent of relatively low cost air quality sensors. They're not scientific instruments, but you can see pretty quickly and put it in the hands for what used to be tens of thousands of dollars, now $100 or $200. And people can measure the air pollution in their home, in their yard, in their community at the micro level. Like what's happening outside of my home, not relying on some report or other data. So it's a real big shift, because it's put the power back in the hands of people to say, I can actually see, make the invisible visible. This is what's happening in my area. I don't need to see the study. I can see the monitor, and I feel it and I can see it. So it's a real shift in terms of the power dynamics of who has the power to monitor.
And also to Maite's point about making that connect, that you were saying that it was surprising how people weren't connecting, they didn't know about PM 2.5. Part of it is you don't see it, right? It is tiny. I mean, this is like many times smaller than a human hair. And so to have a device like this that actually makes it a little bit more visually apparent to you in some way is one of the ways to sort of get a better understanding for it.
And to your point, Joe, putting the power into the hands of community, the community that lives this and breathes this, is really important, because they are the answer. They're able to really speak about their experiences to elected officials, decision makers. They can really be a powerful support in helping to change what happens in their communities.
To what extent is there a relationship between citizen science and the work that you all are doing in the more kind of traditional sense of science? Is there a lot of conversation happening and collaboration?
I'll jump in first. I think
Yeah.
absolutely. We had a really nice conversation over lunch about the overlapping work. So my team right now, we're doing a project out in Lahaina related to the wildfires, and the wildfires long extinguished, but the exposure to particles as things get resuspended during the reconstruction is causing continued exposure. But we're doing it with community partners from there who know the landscape, been absolutely devastated in terms of loss of life, loss of property, loss of community, but they're able to, they have the monitors, they have the network, they're trusted partners. So there's no way we could ever pull off this kind of work without partners like Maite. And we're not working with her on that project, but it's very similar.
Yeah.
We'll probably work on other ones after the lunch conversation, I'm sure.
Great.
But yeah, it has to work like that. Yeah.
And that collaboration is now easier to do because of the tools that are available that are less expensive and more accessible, and these partnerships as well.
Some of my work has a different flavor. I will not consider myself in any way someone expert in citizen science as well, although I completely recognize the value and the importance. I think the way that we are trying to try to inform the local community is to provide interpretable, transparent, and localized information. So because we analyze entire national care system and air pollution data and claims data for all the continental United States for the last 20 years, instead of just publishing once again a research article, is to provide actually easy to access and localized data, so then the local community can actually go on the computer and see what's happening in their own census tract. Not only what's happening in terms of level of pollution, but also to understand whether or not their community is more at risk for certain diseases than others. And then it's really providing an empowering tool, as well as monitoring and reporting and we'll talk about that later, where there are the most dangerous, for example, coal-fired power plants, and whether or not they are near their community, whether there are other industrial facilities they could have adverse health effect. And so it's trying to provide the rigorous data, so then we empower the community to speak.
Sure. So it's like a two-way street, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You were talking before about how the Clean Air Act has helped kind of eliminate some of the major sources of pollution, or at least mitigate them to some extent. And the EPA recently approved stronger standards for soot pollution, strengthening the annual health-based national ambient air quality standard for fine particulate matter. How do you expect that this will impact air quality in the U.S. going forward?
Well, it will have a huge impact and a positive impact because that's the law. And so, I think that the revision of the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, for context, the current safety standard for long-term exposure to fine particulate matter is an annual average of 12 microgram per cubic meter, and the Biden administration has recently announced that it will be lowered to 9, a national average of 9, so three units, which is a substantial act in terms of making it more stringent. I'm really proud to say that the school, and starting with the Harvard 6 City studies and many of the studies that myself and my colleague have conducted, have been instrumental in forming that. The rule is one of I would say, the biggest public health victory in a very long time. So it's going to have a huge effect, for the simple fact that by law, the counties, all the different states, will have to submit to the Environmental Protection Agency a state implementation plan. And they will have to tell the Environmental Protection Agency if they're not in compliance with the rule. So if their annual average or some approximation is higher than 9, how they're going to get there, how they're going to be in compliance. And so what it means also, it means that they will have to look very closely to their inventory. What are all the sources of fine particulate matter, whether it's traffic, where is industry, whether it's natural gas, coal-fired power plants, and then they will have to say how they're going to cut that sources to be in compliance. And so lower fine particulate matter, less adverse health effect, and longer life for everybody. So it's a really good, fantastic victory.
But why 9? Why is 9 the number?
Oh, that's a very good question. So we did a study in the New England Journal of Medicine that was like accelerated to get to inform the rule, and we look at the health benefit when you go from 12 to 10, 12 to 9, 12 to 8. And so, one might ask, well, why not 0, right? So I think that 0 is nearly impossible because there is always going to be some background level of fine particulate matter. The evidence that there are thousands of studies all around the world, none of the studies have provided evidence that there is a threshold, or what that means is a lower level of fine particulate matter below which there is no adverse health effect. So bottom line is, ideally, you want it to get as low as possible, as low as feasible. In the study that we published, we showed that, of course, going from 12 to 8 will be the best, especially for underrepresented minority, because in that study, we really want to look at the benefit, not only on average for the population, but also look at the benefit for the different underrepresented minority. They went to 9, which to me, it sounds like they try to be as aggressive as they can, still being feasible, right? But there is not data to point out that 9 is the magic number, and below 9 there are no adverse health effects. So it's a compromise between the science and I would say the political landscape.
We love a number
Yeah.
that we can hang our hats on.
Yeah, and to that very point, it's slightly problematic. I mean, so I was on the panel that came up with this, and this is really, it's all about how the sausage gets made, right? So it's a bunch of people around a table, and there are those arguing for it to be higher, and there are those like me who are arguing for it to be lower, and we battle over it, and they settle on something. But one of the issues is, that panel is not supposed to take economic considerations into account, right? Okay. So now somebody else does that at some point. So that's another thing that plays in. But to Francesca's point, it is true. The data, you can go down lower, and the data sort of, I personally think actually would suggest lower is also very protective. But weird things happen, like they want a number, right? And so when they look at studies, they say, well, what was the mean of the exposure in that study? And so that study must be speaking to the mean. And so I spent a lot of time in this panel arguing that there's a lot of great data that's not at the mean, and it's below the mean. And in fact, if you only had the mean, you don't have any kind of distribution, so you can't show anything. And it's things like that we're making arguments. They actually tended to downgrade Canadian studies because they're not in the US, but Canada happens to be cleaner. So they have studies at lower levels. But some people downgraded them because they're not American. So, it's that kind of process.
I am grateful for the work that you contributed. The new pollution standards will improve air quality and begin to address the injustices and inequities that have existed historically.
I will say that the WHO's limit is 5. They suggest 5. Now, surprisingly to me, and I only learned this relatively recently, that Europe is actually worse than us. Their levels are higher than we have. But the WHO, which is really supposedly just focused on health, has come down to 5.
While we're talking about numbers,
Yeah.
so our colleagues here have done amazing work and saved many hundreds of thousands of lives because of this effort to get the national ambient air quality standards from 12 now down to 9. WHO says 5. And Francesca pointed out these are legally enforceable. That's why they'll work. Do you know what the legally enforceable particle limit is for indoor air and workers? Not 12, not 9, not 5. 5,000. 5,000 is the current legally enforceable limit for indoor particles. There's a major disconnect because outdoor pollution penetrates inside. We have indoor sources of particles, and yet for our workers, the only standard is OSHA's standard. It's grossly out of date. So we're down at 9, 5, 12. This is going to have we know it's going to have a massive impact on 12 to 9. What would it do if we lowered our worker limit from 5,000 to something reasonable, like orders of magnitude lower? And we have national ambient air quality standards because of the work of my colleagues over decades. We don't have a national indoor air quality standard. So today we're talking about how does air pollution impact the brain. I think all of us, first thought is outdoor air pollution. There's a whole other world of air pollution. It's indoor air pollution. And our standards are nothing like what we've done for outdoor air pollution or the successes we've had. It's a major problem in public health. And quite honestly, in our regulatory structure, how we think about air pollution as just outdoor air pollution.
Why is that?
OSHA on its website says our standards are out of date. They acknowledge this, and that's for chemicals and everything else. We don't spend as much time thinking about the indoor environment, not nearly the amount of resources. We don't have a study like Francesca said, millions of people. A big study in my field, I mentioned 450 people. It's very different. We don't have these huge cohort studies. We haven't done this Harvard 6 City study, followed tens of thousands of people for 10 years. We haven't done it to the indoor environment. It's a loose collection of researchers scraping for money, really trying to uplift this research. But that's, it's just we don't think about it. There's a regulatory issue. Who has regulatory authority over this? EPA is outdoor. They have guidance on indoor, but no real regulatory authority. So it's really OSHA is the legally enforceable limits for worker protection indoors. Doesn't count for your home either. This is a real problem.
So yeah, I mean, thank you, Joe. I think that's a huge issue. I think that what's the most important thing to do in that context is to identify what are the indoor sources that get to these extremely high elevated PM2.5. I mean, I would say in the great majority, if it's low PM2.5 outside, it's going to be low PM2.5 inside, unless workers are working in a setting where this level of fine particulate matter are really high. So I think that there is definitely need. You don't need to conduct a study like million people. I think what you need to do is to identify sources of indoor pollution that lead to this high level of PM2.5 indoor and then regulate.
One of the issues is, yes, in the work setting, you can potentially think of regulations through OSHA. But in your home, you turn on your gas stove, and Joe will tell you, you're going to get a massive spike of particulate matter. So, what do we do with that?
Yeah, if you're cooking, you're stir frying something, you'll get particle levels at 100, 200, and depending on your ventilation or filtration, it'll linger for hours indoors. And so you have indoor sources. You also have outdoor pollution sources, and even think about what happens with outdoor. Let's say it's 12 microgram cubic meter outside, and your building takes out half of that, so it's 6 inside. All right, your building did a good job, but you spend 90% of your time indoors. Most of the outdoor air pollution you breathe happens inside. Most of the outdoor air pollution you breathe happens inside, even with that reduction happening, just because it's the amount of time. So, but we know we can design, to get the solutions, we can design places that actually reduce that 12 to virtually nothing if you have good levels of filtration, good building design. So we can lower that burden even further. So you have the indoor space. All right, I'm biased. This is my topic, but we're talking about air pollution. I think it's really important.
Yeah.
You have outdoor air pollution that penetrates inside.
Right.
We're breathing it, outdoor air pollution inside. Plus, you're inundated with all these indoor sources, and then workers can have totally disproportionate impacts depending on whatever they're doing, where the particle levels can be in the thousands of microgram per cubic meter.
Well, you raised such an interesting point, because you can think about things that you can't really regulate out of existence, like wildfires.
Yes.
Right? But you could potentially regulate, say, a building code to be more protective of people on the inside. So, and wildfires is something that I want to talk about, because increasingly that's becoming a big story for us globally, across the US, and even here in the Boston area, where we're starting to feel the effects of wildfire smoke in a more regular way, including last summer. So, let's talk more about what people can do to protect themselves in situations when the air quality is bad. And Mai-Tai, why don't you talk about that? Why don't you start out?
I think for communities, the more we can equip them and with opportunities to learn about PM 2.5 and how to, and then help them to also create their own plans for their families and households about what is around them and what are the practical things they can do in indoors as well as outdoors, like wearing a mask and staying indoors if there's a wildfire or there's smoke in the air. I think also communities want to be part of the solution. So when Francesca mentioned green space and parks, communities are planting trees and native plants. They want that oxygen. And so I think equipping communities with more information will help them be part of designing what those practical methods to protect themselves are.
Joe, do you want to talk some more?
Sure. I think it'll combine some threads about these low-cost sensors and what to do with building and outdoor air pollution. So when the wildfire blanketed the East Coast, the Canadian wildfires, the skies in New York turned orange. And so the levels hit, 300, 400, right? Maybe even higher. In buildings that weren't designed well, have low levels of filtration, we'd see 200 or 100 inside. That's extremely dangerous. But in buildings that put in enhanced filtration, the exact kind of filters we were talking about all through COVID, maybe people are familiar with the MERV 13 filter or higher, we saw much lower levels. So I'll give this building as an example, because the wildfire smoke hit Boston first. Outdoor levels were extremely high in Boston. Indoor, we kept it below the National Ambient Air Quality Standard because we have upgraded our filters to MERV 13 or 15. Those capture about 80 or 90% of the particles. We have the portable air cleaners running here, and we knew it was successful in real time because we deployed a real-time air quality sensing network in our classrooms. So not only we say, hey, we think the building's operating correctly, we can rely on the outdoor air monitors. We had indoor air quality monitors that said, yeah, our building's performing, and actually we could rightly reassure people that, well, the outdoor pollution's bad, inside our buildings we're safe. Harvard School of Public Health is doing this, Harvard Business School. We just got the Harvard Health Clinics to put in air quality monitors. I work with a lot of companies that do this up and down and across the world at this point, actually, to measure indoor air quality and then improve things like filtration as a protection against wildfire, but also just everyday outdoor air pollution.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, it's fantastic. And I think, although it reminds us once again of the potential inequity that we see with the consequences of climate change related exposure, right? So, Harvard, we're now breathing clean air, right? And we have the ability to put expensive filter. And we know, because we are the expert, as well as, potentially very well-off companies, but what's happening in the communities. And so we do know that as a result of greenhouse gases and climate change, we're going to have this wildfire becoming more common and more extreme. And they are highly educated, and people that are well off will be able to have access and purchase expensive filters. What are we doing as a science community to disseminate the information and provide the resources of the low-income community that we know already right now they're going to be affected? Are they going to have access to that filters? And so I think also I have to say that I've been seeing the major tech company, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, they actually are stepping in to provide. I mean, a classical partnership. Why Amazon? I mean, and I'm saying that live, that has all the resources, will not cost them too much to deliver and send free L filter to the low-income community, where we know it, we can tell them right now which will be the community that will be affected by the wildfire. So I think indoor air is important. It's critical, important, and we can now have the tools to clean the air indoor, but we need to make it accessible to everybody and not only to the, the people there they can.
All right, Amazon, if you're watching,
Yes.
it's a spot.
Jump in.
Yes.
Just as a warning, we've only got about 3 minutes left. But Mark, did you have anything you wanted to weigh in about this?
Yeah, well, I wanted to, this is sort of touching on another point that I would
Yeah.
like to talk about, the business of we talk about sources indoors and whatnot, but this is also true outside. And so wildfires is an example of one source of PM, but I think it's important for people to understand that, I mean, PM, particulate matter 2.5, is simply stuff in the air. It's whatever of that size. And depending on whether you're in Boston or LA or Phoenix, that's going to be different, right? I mean, on the coast, it might have a lot of sea salt in it, for example. Wildfire is a very specific one. This is an area that we're not as advanced in, and partly because the models are not so that as extensive to be able to say what is actually in that particulate matter. Because for the brain, it's very important. I mean, you can have a lead element, atom stuck to a particle that gets into your brain, and that lead will do something very specific. Something else might do something specific. So knowing where they come from not only helps us understand a little bit potentially about what is really the most toxic factor, but also how to intervene on a public health perspective, because it's possible. And a recent paper came out on dementia trying to do this, looking at sources, and they kind of said, at least in this paper, I think it's the first, I'm not going to say this is the final answer and more needs to be done, but they sort of they said that the wildfire signal and agricultural PM was particularly related to the dementia, the subsequent dementia, right? So trying to figure out what piece of this, is it traffic, is it coal power plants, is it wildfires? Now wildfires we can't do much about, but they're particularly interesting because, I mean, there's massive heat generated there, all sorts of, even if it's in the forest, strange things come up, dioxins get produced, things of that sort. But more and more, these wildfires are actually at the interface between forest and urban areas. And now you're starting to burn homes and buildings, and that's producing all sorts of different stuff. So it's a very different gamish depending on where you are. And part of, I think, where we need to go in the future is to try and pinpoint, does it matter? Is it any of this stuff, or are there particular ones that are particularly relevant? Because that may tell us where to focus our efforts on interventions.
I'm gonna just queue up our last question rapid fire style because we have like 1 minute left. If you could change one thing today to improve air quality, what would it be? Let's go right down the line.
Expand the number of citizen scientists in the most affected communities.
Nice.
right.
Related to what Francesca was saying, we were trying to change the standards. The only way it benefits everyone everywhere is if the standards change. We're changing standards for outdoor air pollution. We're trying to get the standards to be changed for how we design and operate buildings such that it's not who can afford a filter and they're relatively cheap, but it's just that's the norm. We shouldn't have unhealthy buildings. It should be the standard should be healthy buildings. That's how they're designed and made and operated.
Shut down all the coal-fired power plants.
All right.
Lower the standard further.
All right. There we go. Well, thank you all so much for this insightful conversation. I wish we had more time, but unfortunately that's it for today.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mark Weisskopf, Professor of Environmental Epidemiology and Physiology here at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and also the director of our NIEHS Center for Environmental Health that is co-sponsoring this event. And I'm very happy to be here today with David Cash, the EPA's Regional Administrator for New England. So we're in store for an exciting conversation, first half streamed to the world, and then with lots of questions driven by our viewers. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Professor Tamara James Todd, who is the Mark and Catherine Winkler Associate Professor of Environmental Reproductive Epidemiology, who'll be facilitating a dynamic discussion after the live stream with our in-person audience here after the live stream ends. So again, thank you. So let's jump right in with the big picture, David. So let's talk about how and why underserved communities, often communities of color, often feel the greatest impacts from pollution, environmental degradation, for instance, in terms of air pollution and proximity to Superfund sites or fossil fuel-fired power plants. How is the EPA addressing these disproportionate impacts?
Yes, that's a great question, and particularly at this moment in EPA's history, where, as some of you may know, President Biden issued executive orders in the first days of the administration that related to environmental protection, to climate change, and all of them had fundamental pieces about environmental justice and how do we address multiple pollution, cumulative impacts that many communities around in our country experience and have experienced. And there's a legacy of experiencing these. And the data is, you would know better than I. And in fact, I'm going to ask you what other data, but you can look at things like asthma rates, which are twice that for in Black communities compared to white communities in the United States. And you can look at, you mentioned Superfund sites, Black and Hispanic. There's a 25% greater chance that Black and Hispanic communities are within 3 miles of a Superfund site. And we know there are exposures to toxic chemicals there. And there are many, many others. And so that's my question. What would be another that you've experienced? There's a lot of expertise in this room. What would be another way to frame that? I told you I was a middle school teacher. And one of the things that I learned there is that teachers often think they wait so long to hear answers when, if you ask them, I waited 10 seconds when it's actually like 1.1 seconds. So I'll just wait. I know we only have a half hour. So what are some other, what would be another data point or a way to frame it? Yeah.
We've been looking at some of the underserved communities in the Central Valley in California as to how long it takes those individuals to evacuate during a wildfire, for example.
Interesting.
The underserved really have it much harder. They can't even evacuate. For example.
Did you?
Right here in Boston, the airport communities, Revere and East Boston, a lot of
Chelsea.
minority communities there, not just air pollution, but also noise pollution.
Right. Yeah, back.
The growing number of people dying or suffering from heat exhaustion and how heat maps vary within Boston itself with greater concentration within Chinatown, for example?
Right. So we could spend hours now having data exposed like this, which demonstrates what the problem is. So your question was why? That's the answer. When we're fundamentally about creating a protective environment that we support human health and environmental improvements, we have to think about it through a lens of justice, because we know that there are communities that have suffered under multiple insults of whether it's water pollution, air pollution, noise pollution, inability to escape from problems. We know even things like post-Hurricane Harvey, wealth disparities increased after FEMA came in to help support communities. So these are the kinds of things that drive what we're doing. And as Administrator Michael Regan says, now is a time that environmental justice has to be part of the DNA of EPA. And what that means is that every program we are looking at how do we weave environmental justice concerns and environmental justice benefits into the work that we do, whether it's in permitting or in our regulations or in how we provide incentives. And there are a lot of incentives now coming through the bipartisan infrastructure law, roughly $60 billion coming to EPA, or the Inflation Reduction Act, which is another $40 billion. I mean, these are huge, huge numbers in terms of, I mean, this is once in a generation of how we're addressing climate change, and we have to get the equity and justice part of this right.
Great, thank you, David. So this is a question from a viewer that sort of follows along on this one. So what viewer wants to know, what power will the new Office of Environmental Justice have to regulate or act if climate initiative rollouts are happening in an inequitable way?
Yeah, so that, first of all, you kind of hid one of the punchlines there, is that a couple of months ago we created a new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. And I know you probably are not people who really care that much about bureaucracies and institutions, but this is the first major office within EPA in decades. So you're probably familiar with the Air Office, there's a Water Office, there's the Toxics Office, et cetera. So this is demonstrating how important environmental justice is, that there's a whole new office. So basically, that office is working with the other offices, with air and water, et cetera, on developing the tools that are part of our regulatory authority, that are part of our legal authority, that are part of our permitting authority to be protective. So if you take, for example, we just issued a permit, a stormwater permit in Chelsea. Some of you may have followed that. Early in the permitting process, there's an opportunity for public engagement and public process. And community members in Chelsea were like, well, great, we're glad that you're looking at stormwater, but wait a minute, there are other impacts. There's air impacts, there's noise impacts, there's other water impacts besides stormwater. Shouldn't you be taking a cumulative impact approach, which we don't generally do? And that started this whole process where our permitting team, working with the Office of Water and Office of Air in headquarters, really evaluated how we could do this permit in a different kind of way. Now, the authority in the Clean Water Act doesn't let us at this point look at cumulative impacts, but we're spending a year plus with a study, working with the community, getting extra funding from the Office of Environmental Justice to really dive into not just what the cumulative impacts in Chelsea and neighboring communities are, but what are the tools that we can bring to bear given the authorities that we have in the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, et cetera. So that's how we would follow up with that. And then there are multiple ways where complaints might come in the way that, was it Vera asked, where our various offices of whether it's enforcement and compliance would, investigate what's happening in those communities.
Great, okay. So also our conversation today, and this is an important point of mine that I'm stressing, is really centered on action and how we do things. So this fall, the EPA released its Environmental Justice Action Plan. So what are the key components of that, and how are they going to apply specifically in New England?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of different components, many of which are being developed right now. I mean, so much of this is new. So much of this has been supercharged by the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think, as you know, many people thought wasn't even going to happen until the end of the summer. we're trying to figure out, as an agency that has been primarily been a regulatory and permitting agency, an enforcement agency, is now a grant-giving agency. And so we're trying to figure out how do we identify what is a community with environmental justice concerns? How do we identify that? How do we figure out what the best tools are to engage with those communities, to provide the funding that those communities need? And here's a really good example that we have concerns about, that we're trying to figure out the mechanisms to make it work. Of course, these same communities don't have the capacity and resources to apply for a federal grant. It's complicated. There's a lot of reporting requirements, et cetera. So we're trying to figure out, well, how can we create, for example, technical assistance institutions and organizations that can be funded through this, through the two bills, that will support communities that are putting together these kind of grants. How can we work with universities where there are students in classes that might want to learn? How do you engage with a community and assist them in the grant writing process, et cetera? So there are a lot of creative ways that we're looking to assure that the benefits as we're moving forward actually go to the communities that we think are in most need.
That's great. Yeah, that's a huge part of our center is community engagement. So talking more about how to make that happen is great. We can have more conversation on it.
Great.
So here's another viewer question. How does EPA measure progress towards its environmental justice?
Yeah, so at this point, we don't have a checklist. It's something that's part of development, but you can imagine everything from things like, well, I know our enforcement division already does this, where they track how many enforcement actions have been taken in these communities. And we're looking at those trends, and we've set goals. So we've had a goal in the past, I think it was 30% last year that the enforcement division in Region 1 was going to try to hit, and they were at like 50%. So they're kind of process-related kinds of goals that we want to hit. But then they're the obvious when you start going to the outcomes of asthma cases would be one. Any of the disparities that you've all identified would be the kinds that we'd be looking at. And certainly with all of the investments, I think, as you also know, the president put forward the Justice 40 initiative, which was saying that any federal dollars, and that's from Department of Energy, EPA, 40% of those need to go to disadvantaged communities. First, of course, you have to identify what does that mean? What's a disadvantaged community? And different agencies are working that. We're working with the environmental justice communities on identifying what those communities are. But then we have to track where is the 40? How has that 40% been spent? How do you define what a benefit is? Because it doesn't say 40% of dollars. It says 40% of benefits go. So there are multiple ways that we are working on this. And one of the really exciting things about being at EPA now is that we're crafting this as we go. And it's really important, and we have to use the best science. We're a science-based organization, and we have to use the best evidence that we have. And so we're working on all that. And some of you may know that we have a variety of different mapping tools, an EJ mapping tool that's continually getting updated. But that's one way that allows us to, for example, look at where there's increased asthma rates, where there's lots of transportation, where there's proximity to a hazardous waste site, and think about, okay, is this where we should be focusing our attention on a variety of different things? And one, for example, is lead. So we do have some pretty good data on where there's elevated blood lead levels in children. I see some of you nodding, so that indicates to me that you know more about what I'm about to say than I know. So I appreciate that. And so that's those kind of mapping tools and that kind of data has driven where we've done, for example, comprehensive what we call geographic programs, where we've, for example, found communities in Hartford, Connecticut and surrounding neighborhoods where we've really focused a comprehensive approach on lead pipe removal, on paint lead paint issues, on soil and lead, all of those kinds of things to take that approach. And I got to tell you, this is anything we do feels to me has to come down to people. And I was lucky enough last week to be at an event down in Fall River, Massachusetts, where we were drawing from two big pots of funding that would replace 11 old diesel school buses with new electric school buses. That was like $3.5 million. And then like $10 to $15 million to replace the lead water pipes that were going into almost, I think it was 1,500 to 2,000 homes. And just extraordinary. You know, if you think about school buses, I went to public school, I took a school bus. I remember going down to the bus stop, and man, it stunk when that bus drove up, and it stunk in the bus. And, you know, I'm sure that's had an impact on me. You know, I was on a bus for whatever it was, 8 years until I started walking to high school. So, and that's a lot of time, you know, 45 minutes every day on a bus like that, probably had some impacts that I'm not even aware of. And our goal is that a parent who's standing on a corner as the school bus arrives is not worrying about what their kid is breathing in, that a quiet, non-smelly bus pulls up and takes their kid to school. That's one. And the other of that day, I went, after we did this event, it was with Elizabeth Warren and Jake Auchincloss and the mayor, and 2 kids spoke, which was totally odd. 2 kids from the Green Team spoke, and of course, they were way more eloquent and great to listen to than any of us, and just really dedicated to their futures, as they should be. And after that event that was at the high school, which, by the way, sorry I'm getting on these tangents, it's all about the same story. A science teacher came up to me afterwards, who, as now you know, I have a kind of affinity to science teachers, and she was so excited, and she was like, oh my gosh, this is so great. I teach science and I teach STEM vocational classes, and these kids are going to learn how to maintain these buses and how to maintain the electric infrastructure that's coming. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is perfect. Of course we want to hire kids from this community who are going to be part of the new clean energy workforce. And that was fantastic. Then I went to the site where they were removing the pipe. And, you know, it looks like any kind of construction site, a big ditch outside the house, and they were yanking the old lead service line out, and the new plastic service pipe was inside and being yanked out too. And as they're finishing up the job, I look in the window of the house, and there's a mom holding their toddler. And the kid is looking out. Obviously, the kid is more excited about the earth mover out there. But I was wondering, like, is this mother thinking, I don't have to worry now when I turn on the tap and I give my kid a glass of water. I don't have to worry now when my kid is taking a bath. How great is that? So whenever I think about these investments that we're doing, that, to me, that's what it's always coming down to. It's the kid who's going to have a job in the clean energy future. It's the parent that doesn't have to worry about their kid breathing in diesel emissions. And it's the parent who doesn't have to worry about water. So that's a really long-winded answer. I can't even remember the question that you gave, but that's where it led.
Well, it was certainly about engagement, and that's one of the ways engaging people is critical. So sort of sticking on the community engagement theme, you've written about the importance of linking knowledge and planning across scales, bringing national, regional, and local voices together. The EPA's Equity Action Plan also calls for engaging underserved communities and integrating participatory science. Can you tell us more about how you're integrating community voices into your work at the EPA and why it's so important from equity?
Yeah, so this is another kind of place where we're really pushing the envelope of what EPA does routinely. There are offices within Region 1, for example, who've been doing community engagement for years and years and years, and have been doing environmental justice work for years and years. And part of, for example, the Superfund law requires community engagement, and it's been incredible to watch these staff members who go out and they literally sit in people's living rooms and explain what's going on. And we need to ramp that up many, many, many times, because whether it's with these permits or with money from the Inflation Reduction Act, we don't know the answers. We don't know. EPA, federal government doesn't know what's most important to these communities, what these communities are most concerned about, where they want investments to happen. And so critically important that we get that engagement. And it takes skill, and it takes empathy, and it takes representing the communities who we serve. And this is another thing that the president has said, and I completely agree with. And if you looked at the EPA office, we don't generally represent the communities in New England who we serve. And certainly we don't represent the communities with environmental justice concerns, who we serve. So we have a big job to do in terms of diversifying our workforce, of engaging professionals who grew up in and live in cities and towns all across New England to work at EPA to help us address these kind of issues. But the partnership goes well beyond just like federal staff who are connecting with the communities. I mean, one of the kind of brilliance of the creation of the EPA in the 70s was the co-regulator relationship that we have with our states. And so there are many, many different statutes where it's sometimes clear, sometimes not clear, but roles and responsibilities are shared by the federal government and state government. In New England, we have state governments who are really engaged and generally forward-leaning on these kinds of issues and are really great to work with. And they're the ones who will generally have relationships with the mayors and the city councilors, et cetera. So you can see this kind of the importance of creating a network from the federal, state, local to the community level that we really have to focus on. And that, again, is another really exciting. We're hiring 10 environmental justice staff members in the next couple of months. I mean, that's remarkable to be pulling so many people on. And those, one of their main goals is going to be working on grants, but it's also going to be part of relating to that is creating the relationships with these communities that are going to be so pivotal to making the wise decisions and smart investments.
So I think I know probably partly how you might respond to this question, but this is one sort of near and dear to me because thinking about our folks here, like the students, the postdocs, the faculty, what are ways that they can best integrate with communities and these community engagement efforts?
All right. Okay. So how long do we have? No, this is a great question, and I think as you know, Mark, our chief of staff, new hire Sanjay Seth, who had been at Harvard, had been at the Kennedy School, has been working with Harvard on an MOU, and is working with the University of Massachusetts Boston as well. And we're going to be looking at other universities. But there are multiple ways that there can be connections. So you can imagine research, kind of the research that you're doing, that EPA can get involved with. And I know that there's definitely been connections in the past between Chan and our researchers. And whether our scientists are in our divisions like the water division or the air division, or at our lab. We have a lab up in Chelmsford, has about 60 or 70 scientists who are there, who cover all of those issues. They treat us as clients. They treat the regional office in Boston with its air and water and Superfund team as clients. So there's possibilities there. But we've really been thinking about this, the difficult nut to crack that I mentioned before of how do we best engage communities and provide technical assistance in a way that allows them to access the kind of funding and technical support. And so we're starting to think that students in a variety of different kinds of classes may be able to serve that role really well as teams of students who develop relationships with cities and towns and communities within towns, or NGOs who want to apply where they might not have the bandwidth, they might not have the expertise, and it would be a phenomenal opportunity for students to learn the federal system and the federal application system. So that's one. That's a couple of different ones. Certainly, I know that your school has done a variety of different ways that you do community engaged science. In fact, I had mentioned this to you, Dr. Levy, who had been a professor here many, many years ago when I first got into state government. There was a pot of federal funds that the environment group wanted to use at the time, because there weren't electric school buses then, to get diesel particulate filters on school buses in the state. And there was this pot of money that would have been enough to retrofit every single school bus in the state. So I connected with Professor Levy, who was doing a really cool community studies where he had folks in Dorchester and Mattapan, where I don't even know what these things are. They're particulate monitors. Is that, am I getting that right? Is that even close?
That's
close enough?
That's good, yeah.
Okay. That showed, what the concentration of particulates were, and tracked it all around the city, and of course saw that in these communities where there was a school bus depot and where the school buses ran, had high concentrations, and of course that was a problem. And then there was a professor with Joel Schwartz. He was affiliated here as well.
Still here in our
Still here. Okay, great. So, and he had done all kinds of cool modeling on the economic impacts of lead. As I see people nodding their heads, where it was pretty phenomenal, showing like there was a correlation between a concentration of lead in the air and economic productivity in the future. It was kind of crazy. So this was kind of interesting. You can politically like or not like Mitt Romney, but he was driven by data. And so this was during his administration. So I approached him with those two pieces of scientific research, Professor Levy's and Professor Schwartz, to show that this like $24 million investment in diesel particulate filters would end up with like a $220 million economic benefit because of education for the kids, that the parents wouldn't have to leave because their kid had to go to the emergency room because of an asthma attack. I mean, all the many reasons. And we went for it. We were the first state that did that, and our DEP was, forward leaning on trying to figure out how to make that happen. So that's another example where the very applied work that you're doing here can be leveraged, whether it has to do with our, permits or policy or investments. But there's another avenue which I think could be pretty helpful.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, so I realize we're going to be running short on time, so I'm going to skip around in some of these questions that came here. But one important, sticking on climate, a viewer wants to know, what are some good examples of climate justice at the grassroots or local level?
So if that question means like actions by the grassroots level or actions with EPA, I mean, there's a.
I don't know. Let's
maybe
take
I'll
that.
try to
Go ahead.
pull those,
Take it.
pull those together. So one of the things is. At EPA, as I said, is a kind of evidence-driven organization, so it does a lot of planning. And we've just finished a regional adaptation plan, regional climate adaptation plan, which took a huge amount of effort connecting with communities, trying to identify where impacts were, and specifically trying to focus on communities with environmental justice concerns who were the most potentially, that the studies were showing were the most potentially impacted. And whether these were because of heat island impacts or coastal flooding or inland flooding, these were the things that we're really focused on. And that document, in some ways, will be a blueprint, certainly very helpful as we're figuring out how much of the bipartisan infrastructure law funding or the Inflation Reduction Act funding that can go to infrastructure and resilience preparedness, how those can be targeted. But it's the same idea as I was mentioning before, right? We want to get school buses in these communities where there's high asthma rates and high respiratory problems, which are going to overlap with environmental justice concerned communities. And we want to try to identify any of the kind of resilience work that we do on these communities that are going to be most impacted by climate change.
Okay, great. And so speaking of those, I mean, the Biden administration has pledged to ensure that investments in climate action will directly benefit communities most affected, as we've talked about.
Yep.
There are many metrics on that. It's not using race as a factor in determining those. Should it be, or without race? How do you, is that going to?
It's a really good question, and there are multiple dimensions to that. One dimension is that there's, there are civil rights laws and equal opportunity laws that are really going to guide where funding can go. And we know that flips, that there can be concerns, political, litigated concerns when race is used. We know that, and we know that that's before the Supreme Court right now, which I believe this university is involved with. That's very much related. That case is very related to this. The other is that, and I think you know this way better than I do, that race is highly, highly correlated with these impacts that we're talking about, right? So, when I said at the beginning that that there's the asthma rate is twice as high in Black communities as white communities, I mean, so we should just go into communities where there's high asthma rates, right? That's where we're focusing, and that's as we've looked at for the school buses, for example, we're looking at where there's asthma rates, we're looking at income, we're looking at a lot of these criteria that are highly, highly correlated. And if that's where we focus our energies, we know that we're going to have the impacts on Black and brown communities as well. And but what we're really interested in is disparate impacts, is the impacts, health impacts, and creating, improved outcomes for health for those communities that need it the most, regardless of race, regardless of, whatever. That's what we want to get.
Great. Okay. So maybe one more. I know we're coming close to the end of the half hour, but touching, I don't want to skip forever chemicals, which has been raised by some
yeah.
of our reviewers. So a major concern in New England is those things like PFAS in the groundwater and soil. And EPA recently put out these advisories, lowering the recommended thresholds for PFAS in drinking water. They're guidelines and not mandates.
Correct.
And in many communities, including communities of color, levels far exceed those thresholds. So will the EPA consider making those mandates?
Yeah. So that's the game plan. The game plan. Let me step back for a second, and I'm just looking at the clock. Go quickly. So first of all, Administrator Regan came from North Carolina, where there were major PFAS issues, and when he was the Secretary of Environment there, he really was challenged by those. And shortly into his tenure, he created a PFAS working group nationwide to start looking at this question. Hadn't really been looked at that much in the prior administration. And it came out with a roadmap last October. And that roadmap identified that we needed to have a path to get to these standards, right? This is they're 11,000, 14,000, who knows how many of these chemicals, right? And a lot of uncertainty. So the first step, at least in the drinking water side, was to come out with these health advisories, basically saying the science says that these are concerning chemicals, and we're not yet ready to set standards, but hey, everybody, those are coming, and these are concerns. So water utilities, you should start looking at options and technologies, and states need to do the same thing. And the game plan, those were released in June, I believe, this last year, and the game plan was that standards would be set by the end of this year, end of the calendar year. And I'm not sure that might slip some, but that's what the game plan is.
Got it. All right. Let's see. All right, so let's finish by talking directly about human health. People living in communities that are most vulnerable to climate change also are often at higher risk of health issues like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, negative reproductive health outcomes, et cetera. Yet discussions around climate change often neglect to include health. This is a school of public health. How do we make health an integral part of the climate change conversation?
So the first way was to have Gina McCarthy be the head of the center.
Not this center, the CJ.
The other center, right.
The other center.
You might remember, sorry.
Please.
Centers all messed up here. She was such a huge advocate of framing climate issues, environmental issues as public health issues. Right. And they are. So, I'll go back and look at the tape, but I'm hoping that I didn't talk about climate change and disregard the public health impacts, because they're huge. And they intersect with all these other problems that we have. And this is the whole question of cumulative impacts as well. And we didn't even talk about, by the way, the non-environment or health-related cumulative impacts like education and jobs and unemployment and history of redlining, all of those kinds of things, right, which impact as well. So, climate is a public health urgency. The urgency about climate change, for public health on climate change, is just as much there as any other dimension that you're talking about climate change.
So the only thing I'd add to what you just said there is that as part of our center, I would say not just the toxic environmental chemicals, because actually part of our center, we've tried to broaden out our definition of the environment to include all those things that we're talking about, redlining, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Great. Thank you so much, David, for your thoughtful comments. So I think
me.
we've hit the half hour, so we're going to say goodbye to our online audience. Thank you, everybody online. And if you missed any part of the program, you'll be able to view this on the Harvard Chan School's YouTube channel. So check that out if you missed any part of this conversation. All right.
Great. Thank
Have
you.
a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Chris Golden, an Associate Professor of Nutrition and Planetary Health here at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and moderator of today's discussion. I'm delighted to be joined by today's panelists. We have Julia Olson, Co-Executive Director and Chief Legal Counsel for Our Children's Trust, Kari Nadeau, Chair of the Department of Environmental Health at the Harvard School of Public Health, and John Rock Professor of Climate and Population Studies, and Alicia Yeaman, Lecturer on Law and the Senior Fellow on Global Health and Rights at the Petrie Flom Center at Harvard Law School, and Adjunct Senior Lecturer on Health Policy and Management at the Harvard School of Public Health. Our Children's Trust is a nonprofit public interest law firm that represents young people in landmark lawsuits designed to secure their rights to a healthy environment. Let's watch a clip courtesy of Our Children's Trust so we can hear some from those young people. Thank you.
In 2018, when I lost my house in a flood, it was due to a tropical hurricane. Climate change definitely had something to do with the drastic changes in the weather and in the fire that just happened. If we don't act now for climate change, we're only going to see more of these disasters, and that's not what I want for my future.
It's not about the government being wrong or these people being evil. It's about changing an unhealthy pattern of behavior that's harming Montana's people.
This trial is barely about our generation right now. We know it's about our futures, but it's about future generations too. We're fighting for them, not just us.
We will not allow the federal government to silence our voices. We will continue to stand in our courts, in our streets, and on the front lines of fossil fuel infrastructure until every pipeline has been shut down.
Our Children's Trust is dedicated exclusively to representing children and youth in courts to stop the climate crisis. The future of 2 billion children is threatened by climate change. Young people deserve to be happy and safe today and in the future. We use our legal and scientific expertise so they can tell their stories. We build the capacity of youth plaintiffs to grow as leaders. In turn, they hold their governments accountable and they advocate for science-powered climate action to protect their own rights to a safe climate.
Julia, can you discuss the underlying legal framework that underscores your mission to universal children's climate rights?
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. Our Children's Trust, we're really based on 3 core principles, and it's this idea that children and young people who will suffer the impacts of climate change more than anybody else, and for the longest period of time, both because they're unique physiologically and mentally, as we'll hear from Kari, but also just because a child born in 2020 is really born into a crisis and a situation that's dangerous. So we uplift these young voices to protect their rights through our legal systems here in the United States and around the world, and also to be heard on a public platform. So we help them do interviews with media and journalists so that they can be part of the public discourse. We help them go and testify before congressional bodies and be heard before administrative bodies. And so that's a really vital component of what we do. And we're in fact the only law firm on the planet that exclusively represents youth on the climate crisis. The second really important principle is we're looking for science-based systemic remedies to the crisis. In my prior career as a public interest environmental attorney, I like to say that I played this game of whack-a-mole, where we were fighting one power plant here, or one pipeline project here, and doing a lot of defense. And we really need visionary systemic approaches to correcting this problem that is not just about one part of the fossil fuel system, but really the entire system that government is promoting and subsidizing and allowing to move forward. And the third component is I really shifted my lens when I had children and realized that the climate crisis, yes, it's an environmental issue, but it can't just be solved through environmental law. That really, at its core, it is a human rights issue and a children's rights issue. And so I pivoted from environmental statutory laws and started looking at constitutions and human rights laws wherever they're found. And so every case we bring is about children's fundamental human rights, and we use the legal structures that are in place to protect those. Here in the United States, it's often the Fifth Amendment or the 14th Amendment or state constitutions that protect right to life and liberty.
Thank you. So much of the legal work that Our Children's Trust is doing relies on robust scientific evidence linking climate change to human health. And Kari, I'm wondering, can you tell us the state of that evidence and what do we know about particular vulnerabilities, both demographically and geographically?
Thank you, Chris, for that question. The evidence is absolutely there. It's incontrovertible that climate change is real, and importantly, that climate and health are inextricably related to each other, and that we have a lot of room to go But there is a lot of room for hope now because our recent Conference of the Parties, for example, in the Middle East this year, 148 countries signed on to a declaration which said that climate and health are related. And importantly, now we need to focus on solutions. But a lot of this came from science. How do we know that climate and health are related? And let's talk about it for children, because I agree with Julia that it is a very important human right to make sure that we have access to nature that is healthy, especially for children. So when we think about some of those climate change events that have affected either you or your families or other people that you know or people in the news, let's talk about heat first. With heat, we know that in 2023, this was the hottest year ever in 100,000 years. The average child today will be born in a world that suffers through twice as many heat waves as when I was a child. That's a lot of heat waves. Why is that important? That can increase asthma for children. That can increase suicide rates for their parents or for teenagers. And it can affect their cognition. So for every degree Fahrenheit increase, if you take that same test as a child, you'll have a decrease in your percentage of the test result. Just think of that. 20-degree difference means 20 points less on a specific cognitive test. So that affects the brain. And that's just heat. Let's think about some of these other effects with climate change and health. The drought. So we have a lot of people in this planet, especially in the global south, that are affected by drought and food insecurity. That leads to displacement. We have about 213 million people displaced every year due to climate change related events. And of that, the majority are women and children. That's going to lead to mental health issues as well. And so that we have to protect our children under those conditions. Flooding is also a major issue. We saw that in Pakistan. And one flooding event can lead to cholera. Children, especially, can have at least a 50% fatality rate with cholera. Vector-borne diseases are another issue around climate and health, and children are at a high risk for that, especially children that live in areas that are inequitably exposed, that already are exposed to toxic events, for example, that have been red zoned, the vulnerable populations that Chris was alluding to. Children are especially vulnerable, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. So those communities that are suffering through environmental justice, that are on borders of red-lined communities that have been unfortunately discriminated against, the children in those communities are even at a higher risk. So for example, their immune systems, because of the stress, for example, of potentially being a person of color, in addition to a vector-borne disease, that makes them very low likely to be able to combat that disease. So all of these issues around climate and health are there. We need to focus on solutions now, but especially for children, because thanks to Julia and thanks to others now, they're gaining their voice, and because the youth movement is gaining voice here in this country. But up to now, they have been those that have been suffering the most from climate change related events, but have had no voice. So to me, this is a moral imperative that we act now, and we help those that typically have been affected most and suffered the most from climate change, and we need to leave no one behind, especially children.
Thank you, Kari. You point to so much evidence about how climate change will impact all people, and particularly children, across all corners of the earth. And yet every nation, and often states or populations within nations, will have different legal protections. And so Alicia, I'm wondering, can you share a bit about what geographical scale is best for addressing these concerns?
Sure. Well, thank you again, Chris, for including me in this conversation. You know, it's a complicated question because not only do every country has its own legal and policy framework, and sometimes subnational units like states, as Julia already mentioned. Sometimes there are regional treaties that also are incorporated into domestic law that affect this. So, for example, in Latin America, almost every country in Latin America has enshrined the right to a safe and healthy environment in their constitutions, and a number of countries have enshrined actually rights of nature, so they're not just human rights. It's an idea of rights that go more to One Health, actually, than just human health. But there are also differences in terms of enforceability, in terms of standing, as Julia alluded to, because in many cases, children don't have access to courts and they can't vote, which is what goes to a lack of voice and a democratic problem. There are problems when courts just don't have the ability to enforce judgments because of resistance from the political organs of government. In some cases, we have seen courts issue judgments that apply to what are called extraterritorial obligations that are transboundary activities, and I think that's a very exciting and promising area to rein in some of the countries in the global north that actually contribute most to climate change. But another aspect of this is the political economy, right? Because different countries do contribute more or less, and climate is, as Julia pointed out, is not something that can be attacked in isolation. Pakistan was underwater in terms of real flooding, but it was also underwater in terms of debt. And when we're asking national governments to do climate adaptation in addition to a whole lot of other things, and yet they are spending so much on debt servicing, we have to figure out what we really mean by leaving no one behind, right? Then the same thing goes with multinational international taxation rules that allow fossil fuel companies to deduct the royalties they pay from taxes. So.
Thank you. Julia, I wonder if I could ask you a similar question. How does your approach differ in each state? How does it differ between the US and your international work? And kind of transcending that, what are the core elements that don't change regardless of the geography and population you're trying to protect?
Yeah, good question. So I'll start by talking about the United States. So from the beginning in 2010, when we started putting together our first round of cases on behalf of youth, we knew we needed a state and a federal approach to securing constitutional climate rights for young people. And so we've always worked state by state. And every state has a slightly different constitution, and every state is playing a different role in the climate crisis. So our recent trial last summer in Montana, in the Held versus Montana case, it was the first constitutional climate trial in history here, where 16 youth went and held their government accountable. 12 of them testified. And Montana's problem is they have some of the largest fossil fuel resources in the United States, and they had never in at least 40 years denied a permit for extracting those fuels. And they're a huge gateway for other fuels coming from Canada and a big exporter. And so we were challenging laws that were really promoting that fossil fuel practice and requiring the state to ignore climate change while it was permitting all of those activities. And in Montana, they also have a constitution that, like the Latin American countries, expressly protects the right to a clean and healthful environment. So it gave us a special hook in addition to the rights to life and safety and security and equal protection of the law. So we go state by state to look at what is the state doing that's really contributing to the problem, and what's the best constitutional hook to protect children's rights. And in the U.S. Constitution, it's the Fifth Amendment. So using the Substantive Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, one of our new federal cases is really trying to carve out the equal protection rights that children should have, especially in the face of government acting in ways that harm kids. Globally, it is different. Some countries have really amazing constitutions, and Alicia and I were talking earlier about it depends on the institutional structure of the courts as to whether you can really enforce those constitutions. So again, we're just looking country by country and with working with partners in country to determine how best can we advocate for youth. And just to wrap up the answer, the thing that remains constant throughout all of these cases is the children's harms from climate change that are already occurring are the heart of the story. And the science doesn't change. So we're bringing the best science forward. Specifically, the safe target climate scientists have identified, which is we need to return atmospheric carbon dioxide to below 350 parts per million and not allow continued increase in temperatures because of the heat and related effects that are really harming our children.
And I'm curious how this work then connects with the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in particular Article 3, which states quite simply that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. And I'm wondering if you could touch on that as well.
Yeah, actually on December 10th, which was, if you may know, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we filed our new case against the U.S. government. It's called Genesis versus U.S. EPA on that day as a signal and a recognition of that document. And I spoke about the document on that day. And what's interesting about the Universal Declaration is it barely mentions children. And when it does, it's really in the context of parental rights. And so I think where we're trying to push the law and evolve the law today is for judges and lawyers and politicians to understand that the law really centers adults and it doesn't center children. And if we can move the law in the direction of protecting children in communities, no matter what the community is, then we can really protect everybody in a community and we can protect nature in much better ways. So I think that's where the declaration needs to move, or that concept.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
And so I think we're realizing that climate change mitigation alone will not solve all of our problems, and we must also prepare and adapt to the health impacts that we're already feeling and that we will continue to feel into the future. And so Kari, what can researchers do to produce evidence that will be useful to policymakers, clinicians, and communities?
Yeah, it's a great question because we are now in the time where we absolutely must act now. The IPCC report from 2022 says, we are in red alert, and this was made by extremely well-renowned scientists that are well-respected. And again, the area of children's health is sort of lacking, but we need to push scientists forward on that. And the data is being collected. So I think to answer your question, before we start adapting and before we start to think about this globally and then country to country, we need to make sure that we measure what matters most. And we need to make sure that we measure it so that then we can best try to help. And UNICEF wrote a great report in complementary synergy with the IPCC report that says that any child born today in the world will suffer through at least one climate change event. And that will be a severe weather condition. And that's just a single one. That's at least. Most children now on this planet will suffer through more than one, especially those that are inequitably exposed in the global south. And then you think of that compounding over someone's life course, as well as mixed effects, not just a climate change event, but also they could be having exposure to pollutants or toxins. And so we study this, and scientists need to look at studying solutions now. And I think that's important. And I want to give you some areas of hope now, because as scientists, we can take our quantification methods that we do so well, especially in the public health field, and that can help regulators and help policymakers move forward and help litigators and lawyers look at the attribution of certain climate change events to health outcomes in children and how that might be inducing bodily harm. And what I like to do is flip it around and say, well, we know that climate is bad for the health of children, but what about the solutions? Because that proves even more that something could have been attributed to that health effect and climate change. So studies have been done. Now we know that for every dollar put in, especially in New England, this was actually not a modeled study, it was done and published already through Boston University and other colleagues that work in this area. For every dollar put in to renewable energy, you get $6 out in health co-benefits alone. And why does that make sense? Well, there's now data to show that if you just reduce a diesel bus to using cleaner fuel, just cleaner fuel, that's not even going to an electric bus, that can reduce asthma exacerbations in children within 30 days by 30%. 30 days. And the bus driver benefits too. So this is data that we're focusing on as scientists because we believe in data, we believe in science, but we need to make sure it gets brought to policymakers. What other things help? Well, we talk a lot about greening and wilding because that's important to get access to nature. Not only is it important as a human right, but it's important for our well-being and our mental health. So children, they've done controlled studies where children are placed in sort of a more concrete jungle nursery school versus a nursery school, same socioeconomic status, controlling for everything else, but this nursery school was wild. Within 30 days, the cognition scores improve. The immune status improves. The vaccine responses improve in those children. So these are unintended consequences that are beneficial to be able to make solutions count and that we as scientists need to measure. And the other thing that we've measured is we, in general, as scientists, if you increase tree canopy by 30% in a city, you can reduce premature deaths by 1/3. So these are all really important scientific areas of inquiry where we can have that data and that data science to be able to make compelling evidence, to be able to help policymakers move the argument forward, and to help our legal colleagues move the argument forward of attribution. So I'm excited that we're part of that. But we also need to be, as scientists, good role models. And so I think that we have a lot of movement to move forward in terms of being able to ensure that our own institutions practice really good abilities to message and communicate well, to bring our science to policymakers and to the public.
Thank you. Lisa, I'd like to ask you a similar question. What can researchers do to produce useful evidence, particularly from a kind of legal policy standpoint? So how are you thinking this could be brought to engage with policymakers or legal scholars?
Well, I think many of the things Kari mentioned are incredibly relevant to policymaking as well as to arguing in front of courts, right? And I think a lot of the evidence thus far has been has been abundantly used in the kind of stop doing bad things kind of way, right? Stop polluting in this way that is creating an asthma problem in a city. Stop doing this. But I think increasingly scientists are bringing evidence to bear that shows what in legal terms we talk about as appropriate steps and measures. So it's very complicated, right? It's what are the different options? What are going to be the inadvertent, unintended consequences? And that evidence, bringing that evidence to bear to show whether governments are actually taking appropriate measures as opposed to just possibly ineffective measures is absolutely essential. And I think that's being done more and more, as is in kind of these larger structural cases and sometimes in monitoring policies as well in some countries. Monitoring, so bringing to bear evidence and interpreting what they learn through monitoring judgments, monitoring administrative regulations, monitoring new legislation, and that's also that feedback loop is very important. I will say this one caveat. There are going to be areas of scientific uncertainty. We saw that during the pandemic. Knowledge moves, and there are legal doctrines that can help us manage that. If there's a doctrine called in dubio pro natura. So even when there is scientific uncertainty, you internalize precaution and in favor of what would be in favor of nature and nature's rights. And the second thing that I think is important to realize is as much as public health expertise is absolutely fundamental, we also learned in the pandemic that one size doesn't fit all, and experts' views can't cover what happens to all kinds of discriminated or disadvantaged populations. And the idea that you're bringing to bear voices of people, lived experiences who are affected is extremely important in interpreting what the scientific evidence means. And I think that's one of the powerful lessons from our Children's Trust's work.
Fantastic. That was really useful. And given these responses, I'd like to point this question to you now. What types of research or other support is most needed for you to successfully do your job?
Well, I'm getting all sorts of ideas about research just as we have this conversation. I think, so the medical research has been instrumental to our cases. It's just been vital because being able to present before a judge what pediatricians and psychiatrists are saying is happening to children in the face of climate crisis has been just vital to us being able to win in Montana, for example. So I'm so appreciative of that. The other piece of research that is really helpful and that I think we need more of is we have experts who are talking about how we do the energy transition. So moving from a fossil fuel-based system to a clean, renewable energy system. And people like Dr. Mark Jacobson out of Stanford have modeled how we do this around the United States and I think in 137 or 141 countries. And he's looking at it at a very granular level, but what he's not doing is going sort of state by state or country by country and creating the plans and mapping out where do you put the renewable energy resources. And so I think taking his work to the next level and putting it on the ground, because what I saw in our trial in Montana is if there was anything that gave people hope, it was his testimony. You know, knowing that this can be done, it can be done by 2040, 2045, but at the latest 2050, and having a vision for how we get there is going to be really, really vital. And then I think there's more and more research being done on the mental health effects of climate change on children and young people. I think it would be really interesting to do more sort of social science research on what world do children want to live in, you know, and what do they want and what are their ideas? We get a lot of that information in working with youth, but I think having a broader study on that to present to policymakers could really inform policy. And then the last thing I'll say is, you know, for organizations like ours, we depend on individual donations and support to do this work. We represent young people entirely pro bono. We rely on the pro bono expertise of people like Kari and Alicia to help us do this work. And so having volunteers and donations is what our Children's Trust needs.
Thank you. It seems like each of you is taking a different approach to tackling the threat that climate change poses to intergenerational equity. And I'd like to ask each of you to explain, maybe in just a few sentences, where do you draw your motivation from and why is this such an important issue to you on a personal level? If you just go down the line. Yeah, sure, okay. Please.
So I've always been a huge nature lover. My favorite place to be is on the top of a mountain. I just came from snow in Colorado with my family. And it was when I had children and I looked in their eyes that I said, I have got to use everything in my toolkit and in my power to leave them a better world and work on climate crisis. So for me, it's the kids in my life motivate me enormously and children around the world, really.
I'm motivated by I think what's affected me and my patients. So as a parent, I agree with Julia, you know, being able to be in nature, having this privilege of being where I am in my life and being very humbly happy with that and having children that can appreciate the planet. But that there are many children, people of color, especially those that are impoverished, that have never gone to our national parks, they don't really even understand how we could perhaps grow a product that they don't even know how a broccoli plant is made, for example, that they eat. So things like this disturbed me as a pediatrician, and that I had a lot of patients that grew up in the Central Valley that had unfortunately suffered through 100 out of 365 days of wildfire smoke. And that really affected their lungs. Their lung development was different from just an area of the country 3 hours away, because wildfire smoke is extremely toxic. It contains paint thinners and detergents, and that's not good for children's lungs. So I think that really inspired me to get moving. And then after I had to evacuate my own home with my own children and all my pets 3 times due to wildfire smoke, I knew that I had to pivot and really focus on solutions and environmental health. So I think those things have motivated me. But what inspires me is the fact that we have a youth movement, that we have our children's trust, that we have scientists now here at the Public Health School and at Harvard University and with Salata Institute to be able to think about solutions to these problems, so that even though there are issues every day that you read in the news that could otherwise perseverate you towards sort of a very negative, pessimistic view, I view that those things need to be highly motivating to be able to try to change the world. And that's what inspires me, that those paths are being made and we need to be part of that pathway.
So I guess listening to Julia, I came to this sort of in the opposite direction because I've been a human rights lawyer for 30 years. I've lived in 7 countries on 4 different continents. I've really worked on economic and social rights, and in particular on health rights for all of that time, doing litigation and organizing and movement building, and working a lot in indigenous communities, especially in Latin America, and seeing their relationship with nature, which is quite different. And as political economy has evolved, and even as transformative constitutionalism has allowed us and given us bigger toolkits, it's quite clear that the world we live in is not, as another article in the Universal Declaration, Article 28 says, which says everyone is entitled to a social and international order that guarantees the enjoyment of rights to everyone. That is not possible with what is happening to the planet. And I see climate change as part of a broader kind of predatory extractivism in terms of labor extractivism and increasingly informal economies, in terms of extractivism of unremunerated care, in many ways. And so I see it as part of interlocking, intersecting systems that deny people and nature, people dignity, children dignity, future generations dignity, and deny nature in the sense that indigenous people talk about Pachamama and mountain gods and Apus, also some kind of respect.
Thank you. And I just want to say what inspiring words you've shared, and it's such an honor for me to be on this panel with you all. To end, I'd like to ask each of you to give some advice for our audience. And people in this country and across the globe are worried about these risks that climate pose to themselves and their own health and to our future. And what can we do to best protect ourselves? And I wonder if I could just ask us to go down the line, and maybe, Alicia, I'll ask you to start and we can go in reverse order this time.
So I would say first, echoing something that Kari said, reject nihilism and fatalism. You know, nothing is preordained that is going to happen in the next years. We are the creators of the future. So first of all, educate yourself, get engaged in whatever way that means, and don't succumb to fatalism, which is so, and complacency. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah, echoing that, it's such an excellent point. I think there is a lot we can do to protect ourselves and protect each other and protect the planet. And understand in all humility that we have the choice in terms of our own extinction, but that this planet will be around for a very long time. And that work that Chris is doing, for example, that we are inextricably related to our health and planetary health, is critical, to be very humble in that. I also think that in order to protect ourselves and protect the planet, having a viewpoint where we can move the needle forward, that we know and can educate ourselves, absolutely. But all of you are here because you are being curious. And also having to listen to communities that otherwise perhaps might not be so curious, but they don't know what they don't know. And so all of you, I hope today, will multiply the message, that you will institute these things that you learned today and multiply, maybe just one other person, but you can be that change to protect yourselves and also protect others. The United Nations, the WHO, the Environmental Protection Agency, the CDC has some wonderful educational platforms that are available, and that can help you protect yourselves and your families, but also help, again, multiply this message to others. Thank you.
Okay, I'll say 3 things. So 1, listen to young people. Like if you have a young person in your life, ask them what they think about climate crisis and how they feel and what their experience is. And then if you're an adult, figure out how you can use your skill set to stand alongside a youth, you know, not in front of them and not behind them, expecting them to be your hope, but really how can you support them and be a mentor, be an advocate with them, because that's what they want, right? They don't want us to do it for them, and they don't want to be our heroes. So, you know, engage with young people. They really do have the solutions. And the second thing is, don't give up on democracy and all branches of government. I think it takes vigilance and work, and we will never be done with growing the more perfect nation that we're trying to embody, or the more perfect world. Like, there will always be injustice, and we have to keep working for justice. And so that leads me to the third thing: we have to do it joyfully. Right? So we dance before we go into court as a team. We work with a trauma consultant. We do a lot of mindfulness work and breath work. And so find ways to be in community and be healthy while we journey through this incredible moment in history.
Thank you. I really want to thank all of you for being here today for this insightful discussion. And we hope to see all of you next time, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.